The first thing I want to say is just welcome. Thanks everyone for coming on a cold December evening. We really appreciate it. This is our annual event, and the first time that I've hosted this as the director of HPG. My name is Freddie Carver, and it's a real pleasure to have you all here tonight. This evening is, for me, it goes back to a conversation that I had right at the beginning of the year when I was still in Nairobi, and the USAID announcements had just taken place. And I was talking to someone I have a lot of respect for who is working on Somalia. And they were saying to me, we've really screwed this up. We had a really strong strong political consensus for humanitarian aid, and we made it too complicated. We told people it was bad. We talked too much about decolonialism. We talked too much about shifting power. We needed to keep it simple, and then we would have had the support. And we need to go back to that if we want to create a strong basis for this going forwards. And those words have been living with me a bit ever since, because it seems to me that actually there has to be a better way forwards, and a return to some kind of very simplistic narrative can't be the right answer. But there's a real tension there. There's a real challenge. And I think we've all spent a lot of this year talking about the impact of the cuts, and the challenges to organizations across the sector and how we move forwards. But underneath all of this, there's a much more fundamental question about really what is this work and how do we build a strong global consensus around its importance. So I'm really excited about the discussion tonight. And I want to hand over to Patrick Gathara. We have a fantastic moderator who's joined us this evening. He's the senior editor for inclusive storytelling at the New Humanitarian. And for anyone who's followed him over the years on Twitter or LinkedIn, you know that if there's anyone that understands the power of narratives in this space, it's Patrick. So we're really honored and happy that you're here with us. And I look forward to the discussion tonight. Thank you so much.
We've got a fantastic panelists here. Ben Phillips, Director of the Public Good Narrative Project, Senior Advisor at the Global Cooperation Institute, and a fellow at the Bellagio Center at Notre Dame University, and Robert Bosch Stiftung. Adelina Kamal, on my far right, co-founder, steering committee member for the South Asian Women Peace Mediators. She's a former executive director of ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance and a member of the panel for of the future of humanitarian action. And then Shaheen Ashraf, head of global advocacy, Islamic Relief Worldwide. She's an international humanitarian, an advocate, a political leader with 25 years of experience shaping policies, amplifying voices across the UK, USA, South Asia, and beyond. Now, all this, they will help us think through both the impact of narratives, what they look like to people who are experiencing a crisis, and also how they then reflect and push the policy actions that are taken, how they impact that, and how a change then could revolutionize all of this. So Ben, just to set us up, in September, the Global Cooperation Institute published a report. I think it's called Building a Winning Narrative to Bring the World Together. And it identifies problematic narrative framing that narrows horizons, weakens public purpose, and it also fuels division. So maybe you can start off by just helping us understand what a narrative actually is. Is it just a story? What is it? And then how have the dominant humanitarian narratives impacted public understanding of humanitarian action and government policy?
Thank you so much, Patrick. That's a great question. And it's brilliant to be with you and with this wonderful panel and with this great group of people. So I think the first thing to emphasize is that narrative is hugely consequential. It's not about wordplay or spin. Narratives shape the policies which shape the world. And so the stories which dominate determine what follows. So sometimes when we talk about problems with humanitarian stories or framings, people focus only as if it's a question of sensitivity, that there's certain undignified language we shouldn't use, and that matters. But the impact of the wrong narrative, it goes far beyond that. The misdescribing of humanitarianism has hampered humanitarian's impact. So when the frame is fundraising, then progress on policy is undermined, and policy is often more important than those immediate resources. When the frame is immediacy, the building of systems is undermined, so the next time people are vulnerable. When the frame ignores that crisis response is a public good and a function of government, then state capability and accountability is undermined. All of these put people in danger. They undermine humanitarianism's purpose. And most recently, we've seen how the frame of rescue of one group rescuing another, didn't only alienate people in the global south, it alienated people in the global north who've become resentful, especially at a time of economic stress, at this imagined role that they are the rescuers. So the rescue narrative sowed the seeds of its own destruction. So the reason we have to get narrative right is not because we need to mind our language, but because a system of effective crisis response is vital, and bad narratives undermine that.
So the bad narratives that exist or propagated. Right now, we are having discussions, across the humanitarian system, as Freddie had mentioned, about decolonization, about localization, about reset, and all of this. Do you think the thinking about the impact of narratives is reflected in the discussions that humanitarians are having?
So I'm really glad that the discussion has begun. I think that really important points are emerging. I would say that at the moment, it doesn't feel like it's gone deep enough, and we need to challenge ourselves to go further. If I can, I'll try and suggest 5 aspects that we might have in a better humanitarian narrative. The first would be that crises can happen to any of us. It's not about people over there, it's about all of us everywhere. And related to that, we are interdependent. I am because you are. Now, in public health, I am because you are is not just theology, it's biology. The reason we need to respond to public health crisis is because if we don't deal with it one place, it comes to another. So that first point, it could happen to any of us, really, really important. The second is that the most important crisis response is always local. Outside help is secondary and complementary. It matters, it would be wrong to get rid of it, but it's also unhelpful to overstate it. International humanitarians are sidekicks. The third point is that crisis response is a public good. Now, when my house is on fire, if I'm in London or Paris or New York, the response is not an act of charity. It is because I have the right to support in crisis and because it prevents the house next door from burning. And the fire brigade comes, the state, not an NGO or a volunteer group. And if bad policy had created that fire risk, then people push for better policy to be brought in. The humanitarian approach to addressing floods and typhoons in the global south should not be a world apart from that. Now, of course, states are problematic, but enabling state capacity and accountability is core to effective crisis response. Fourth, don't underestimate people's ability to process a complex reality. And I include within this the public in the global north. I mean, all of our kids are climate activists. They get that economic policy drives risk. And we saw over Gaza huge mobilization in every Western country, where Western publics demanded their governments call for a ceasefire. And Western publics understood absolutely that people in Gaza were not just starving, they were being starved. So tell the truth, tell it well, but tell it. And fifthly, always remember that this is not about how much money one organization raises today. It's about how safe people around the world will be in this era. I think if we build on aspects like that and the broadening of humanitarianisms, as you've spoken of, Patrick, so powerfully, I think that we can do something quite special together. And I think that we can remake humanitarianism, not save the old, but remake and rebuild something better.
Right. Adeline, let me just come to you based on what Ben has just said. How do these narratives look like from the perspectives of people who are actually experiencing crisis? Do they think that their realities are reflected in how we speak about them?
Thank you very much for the question. Good morning, Ben. Ben is in Bangkok, so I have to say good morning. And thank you for starting off with bad narrative versus good narratives and how it is actually affecting the policies and also actions on the ground. My region, I come from Indonesia. Yeah, Indonesia is part of this so-called Southeast Asian region. It provides very good illustration on how bad narrative and good narrative are played out, and how they can actually lead to legitimacy issue, and how those narratives are contested. So, and I'm going to give you 4 examples. I came to London 2 days ago. I arrived yesterday. Yeah, it took me like more than a day to reach here. And there's flooding, massive flooding, affecting Sumatra, which is one of the biggest provinces of Indonesia. So the trending example, the trending topic in the Twitter or X right now is flooding in Sumatra. And during this ongoing massive flooding in Sumatra, we witnessed the so-called battle of narratives of what caused the flooding. Yeah, the flooding already led to hundreds of lives, already claimed hundreds of lives, affecting thousands of people, not only in one province, but also several provinces, including Aceh, that got affected by the tsunami in 2004. Right. And the governor said that it's a tsunami 2.0 because villages are swept away, yeah, and all that. The military, however, frame it as a pure natural disaster, and this is a 2-star general, yeah, in charge of Sumatra. The civil society pointing to extraction and illegal logging. Government's climate agency acknowledging land use change and climate change with extreme weather as the first trigger. And the communities sharing their life reality on social media in real times. We're very good with social media. So the public compared these narratives, and they're not stupid. Yeah, they understand ecology. They see actually on the screen how logs are being carried, by the flood. And when narratives don't match reality, people stop believing you. So that's what I call battle of narratives. People will judge. Second, engineered narratives. Myanmar is another country in Southeast Asia. And Myanmar gives us even a sharper example. The military junta, you know that there was a coup in 2021, yeah? When the senior general basically was not happy with the results of the election. The military junta is illegal, illegitimate, and rejected by the majority of the population. They face a deep legitimacy crisis, politically sidelined by ASEAN, the regional organization. So what they do, they govern through fabricated narratives. I even say it very fabricated narratives. Staging sham election coming soon at the end of December, manufacturing normalcy, as well as claiming centrality in the post-earthquake coordination that just happened a few months ago. And international humanitarian community fell into their trap. Of course, the Myanmar people reject these narratives, But like what I said, the humanitarian actors still center the junta because of access.
Right.
And they refuse to recognize the pluralistic state emerging from bottom up. So from the people's perspective, it is comprehensible. How can a humanitarian sector, how can a sector claiming humanity lean toward the main perpetrator of the crisis,
Right,
and ignore the political reality transforming underneath, right? So that is really like a very good example on how narratives are being contested and how humanitarian sector and international humanitarian actors fall into the trap.
right. And that's kind of links to what Ben said about sort of this idea of thinking of the state both as an actor in crisis, as in what we expect it to provide, but also as a cause of states. And before I come to you, Shaheen, Ben, could I just ask you, when you talk about the us centering the state, how do we understand this in a space where lots of the crises we see around the world are driven by these states? People are not going to be demanding that they give them services if they're the people killing them.
Sure. I think we do need to aim for states that are effective and accountable. Anything less than that, and we won't have effective crisis response. Neither will we have effective service delivery in any sense. Now, governments are capable of huge harm, but that doesn't mean that our only demand from government should be that they leave us alone. We need to aim higher than that. And so the fact that you know, terrible things can be done by soldiers doesn't mean that we don't deserve public sector nurses, teachers, fire brigade, civil response. So our intention should not be that we ignore failings by the state, not at all. But our claim on the state is not simply that they leave us alone. Our claim on the state is that citizens have rights and states are accountable to serve them. Part of that picture needs to be ensuring that states can be effective and capable, and part of it is about holding states accountable. Both are important, but anything less than that, and we're looking at substandard services. So we shouldn't romanticize situations in which nothing is being done through state systems. Whenever that's the case, things are not good. And our aim should always be that in the end, what we want everybody to have is a public sector that is effective and accountable.
Right. So Shaheen, you straddled both worlds of humanitarianism and policy and elected politics, if you see. How do these pressures, how do they reflect, the pressures created by donor expectations, public misunderstanding of crisis, digital attacks that we see people suffering online? How do you navigate those pressures? And I'd also want you to address the point both Adeline and Ben are making about the role of states, because I think there's a big question about whether humanitarians should be engaged in trying to change the causes of crisis as opposed to simply responding to them.
Thank you, Patrick. No mean feat there. Asking 5 questions in one. But, you know, we're living in a period of what I see as collapsing public confidence. Institutions of all kinds. So if you, according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, we're living through a crisis of grievance at this moment in time. And so, which puts pressure on trust itself. So everything that you've mentioned is around trust. The trust index, which is an average trust, is based on businesses, government, and NGOs. And in that, the level of distrust according to the index, is very high within those three categories. And out of that trust barometer, they speak about people who were surveyed who are worried about the fear that leaders lie to us all the time, which is very high in that. So we're seeing a significant shift from government leaders and business leaders and journalists and reporters and NGOs within that space. So for example, government leaders from 2021 to 2025 went from a trust perspective from 58% higher to a 69%. So that's the trust element of it. So I'm going to answer your three-part question in three points. And out of that, journalists and reporters went from 59% to 70%, which people said that they purposely mislead by saying things that they know are false or gross exaggerations, which is probably what you've alluded to in that sense. And then, and coming back to that barometer, the survey participants said they approved of hostile activism to drive change. So they believe that if you attack people online, that increased to 27%. 1 in 2 young adults approved of hostile activism. So from the ages of 18 to 34, that was 53% of that population that was surveyed. And from 35 to 54 was 41%, which leads me to the second part of your question around donor expectations. Look, as Islamic Relief, between 92 to 93% of our donors are individuals. Our biggest UN agency that gives to us is WFP, and that being the largest institution that we get funding from, and that is in Gaza, in Yemen, and in Sudan, as do other UN agencies in that, like UNOCHA and UNDP. So on coming back to that, on charitable Muslim giving, for example, you see the congruency of behaviors based on intentions, also based on religiosity or altruism in this space. So just going back to the people narrative again. So which leads me on to the third point, which is on behavior. And part of the question you asked was around misinformation and on public attacks. So most of you know Islamic Relief, or maybe not, but Elon Musk mentioned us in a tweet, as he did other Muslim NGOs in a tweet that he shared. But closer to home, yesterday we were at the High Court. But here's the thing. I think if we're drilling down, there is another element that we have to get to when it comes to humanitarianism, which is the fake news that is being spread, particularly around misinformation, disinformation. And so what we're seeing is that in the Harvard Business Review, it said that 70% it's more likely to be shared of fake news. And in that, fake news is stubborn in the fact that the problem is not likely to go away, and 38% of all US social media users accidentally shared a fake news story, right? So it's about picturing about where we want to go as humanitarians, because so far that is something that governments use, NGOs use as part of a new tradition of humanitarianism, because that's how we give our stories, the narratives. We speak to our narratives in those stories. So like according to a Trusted Web Foundation, it's likely that an even bigger problem in the coming years as trust in legacy media continues to erode. And just another point to mention is fake news is very distinct from misinformation or false rumors, whereas disinformation is deliberately fabricated news. And I think that's really important, because when Ben was speaking earlier, he spoke about the narratives. So we saw that in humanitarian agencies when the Gaza crisis happened. UNRWA was attacked. UN agencies were attacked. Palestinian NGOs were attacked. That all came under fake news, misinformation, disinformation. And suddenly the humanitarian sector was scrambling to find out what is good and what is fake and what is real. And all of a sudden, the state that we operated in was beyond humanitarianism.
Right.
So where were we pitched? So coming back to yesterday, the broadcaster GB News has apologized and paid substantial damages to Islamic Relief, airing unfounded and without evidence of an interview that came on GB News And what they accused us of was an agenda of promoting extremism and radicalization. So these are the areas that we now operate in. It goes beyond the humanitarian lens. And so equally, the Daily Mail apologized for similar allegations. So the narrative that we speak of has to change. And how does that change in an area or era of AI where there is this misinformation and disinformation? And it's not always possible as humanitarian agencies to take legal action because you don't know how to navigate those pressures. It's too much on one organization to do that. But I do offer you this challenge. Can we, and we spoke about solidarity, and this is a narrative that is going to take place and it's going to expand beyond our humanitarian lens. Can we come together as a sector? How do we come together as a sector to challenge this information, to challenge this? Because it's not going to go away. And actually, that apology was spread through, that news was spread throughout the UK and internationally, but only a tiny fraction of the people will see the apology, and they will think that it's real. And yeah, in answer to your question, I think I did well.
You did. I think you brought in quite a lot of points. Adelina, if I may come back to you, as I said before, there's this idea that the humanitarianism that we have is basically one thing that we've, it's all about saving lives and everybody does this. You've spoken a bit about ecosystems and compared them with and ecosystems. So I wanted to sort of come back to that, the systems that are created and based on sort of the egos of the people running it, as opposed to having a humanitarian ecosystem that works with everyone. But before you do that, could you just speak about this idea that humanitarianisms exist that are different in different spaces, that are probably predicated on different sorts of ethics? And are there ways of bringing them together into one thing, or should we live in a world of many different ways of doing humanitarian work?
Okay, so perhaps there are also many questions
Yes.
there. So I'm going to tackle one by one. So there is no, the humanitarianism is not a singular tradition. It's plural. Yeah. In Indonesia, for example, we have this words, and it is in Bahasa, it's gotong royong. That means helping one another. Gotong royong. And I think when it comes to another form of humanitarianism, right, other than the Western humanitarianism, the strongest humanitarian legitimacy is the one that is rooted in the long-standing community systems. And they predated the international humanitarian system. They predated the UN. They predated even Indonesia. They already existed, right? And we see that during COVID. We see that during the current massive flooding, right? How actually community-based organization, faith-based organization, churches are helping one another. And this represent, as proven by ODI study in 2019, 98% of the actual help coming into the disaster. Yes, and the 2%, I think Ben mentioned, are the sidekicks. Right, are the sidekicks. But the discussion in Geneva, in New York, in Europe, have been focusing on the system, right? On the system, the humanitarian system, while there are other, not only other forms of humanitarianism, but also other humanitarian actors who are actually playing most of most of the most of the work, right? So therefore, I argued, and it's accepted. Well, it's included as the title of our vision paper of the advisory group for the humanitarian action convened by ODI and NIR, that we need to move from a ghost system, into ecosystem, because when we witness disaster, when we go to the conflict zone, right, there is more than one system. There is an ecosystem with plurals. There are many actors, like those selling tomatoes, right? So when we think about ecosystem approach, you are forced to decenter the global institution and work with the others in a mutual and interconnected way. What was the other question? That's to answer your question about ecosystem and ecosystem,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I'm interested in the these different humanitarianisms, these traditions that exist, and they exist around the world. You can think of the ERR, the emergency rescue rooms in Sudan, and what that's based on, which is more local traditions of solidarity and mutual aid. What can the international humanitarian system learn from that in terms of changing how it approaches or how it thinks about what constitutes humanitarian aid and humanitarian even principles themselves? I think one of the issues I think both you and Ben had brought up is this idea of, like, for example, involvement of states. And I'm wondering about, and I'd asked Shaheen this. I think she very smoothly kind of went around that. But what role should humanitarianisms play by learning from these other traditions in actually dealing with causes of crisis, rather than just being people who provide just aid at the top? Should they be more engaged, and can they learn from other traditions in how to do that?
Oh, the question for me.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I like what Sharin said about solidarity narrative, right? Gotong royong is basically solidarity. And our humanity principle is rooted in solidarity. But what actually stands out about solidarity narrative is that it is vertical. Yeah? No, it's not vertical, it's horizontal. Right? It's not vertical, right? There is no a giver and recipient. Everybody actually suffer, and everybody help one another. And that also part of dignity, because humanity means not only saving life and reducing the suffering, but also protecting dignity. And no one wants to be at the receiving end all the time. Right? And therefore, the solidarity narrative, the way I see it, is so powerful, because you decenter, you retire the word donor, because everybody becomes donor. It's everybody's problem, right? And there is no one that is more powerful or superior than the others. So that is the power of solidarity narratives. Now, on how we confront the root causes, under humanity principle, this is what we wrote also in our vision paper by the advisory panel. We argue that we need to recenter equity and justice. That actually has been the problem, because we have seen dehumanization, right? And dehumanization happened because we forgot the basic things about humanity. That when we talk about humanitarian action, it's about being human first, right? And it's about protection of the dignity, making sure that people feel human doing it and receiving it. And therefore, there are now calls for justice and equity, particularly coming from the global south. Climate justice, data justice, right? And recently, humanitarian justice. And humanitarian justice declared by humanitarian observatories from 8 different contexts of crisis. Arthur Larrock, the Secretary General of Action Aid, wrote for the New Humanitarian in March or in April. He said that you want to renew the humanitarian system, let's start with justice, not charity. I also have proposed the so-called concept of aid justice, which is quite close to what Arthur Larrock has said. Aid justice transcends the political divides, the divides between development, humanitarian, and peace. Basically, it reframed aid on justice framework. And that is important for those who are impacted by the crisis, because it's not about only receiving, right, but also contributing, and also be part of the action, but also not being considered as victims all the time.
Right. Shaheen, what can we learn? I mean, speaking, you work with Islamic Relief. This is a faith-based humanitarian organization. Does it have the same principles as the international humanitarian system, or is it different? And if it's different, what can the humanitarian system learn from it in terms of thinking about it, it improves its own practice?
So I would say dignity is at the heart of everything that we do, and justice is part of that narrative. I love the fact that you said ecosystem before, because I thought that was a Freudian slip. But in actuality, it's actually true. Yeah. It's and so I think, when you talk about the Western charity narratives, so we are a Western charity with Western diaspora donors. So we're not, in this context, we're not the other, right? We may look like the other, but we are not. And I think that's really, really important to note. So I think when we're talking, and if we talk honestly about this with each other as humanitarians, it's really clear that the stories that we tell about aid really, really matter, and how we tell those narratives. Sometimes the dominant Western narrative shapes the very big institutions, shapes the donor power that we see, and even the egos that exist within that system as well. Let's face it, we all know 1 or 2 of them, or maybe more, right? I can already hear, so unintentionally that drowns out the very rich humanitarian traditions that we've always had, as Adelina said, that already live within our communities, and the communities that we serve. And when I say Western, or when you said Western, because I'm just responding to your question, I mean the set of assumptions and systems that have come to dominate global aid. That's what it boils down to. Professional NGOs, technical frameworks in languages that people don't understand, stories that put external actors at the center are not the very people that we are meant to serve. So I think that's one of the things that we need to probably talk honestly about. But I think also, and many communities, including Muslim communities, have been practicing humanitarian aid for over 1,500 years. This is not something new to us. as an organization, we were established 41 years ago, but the concept of humanitarianism has existed in communities, like Adelina has said, and in the narratives that Ben spoke about, guided by justice, guided by mercy, and above all, guided by dignity in that sense. So the concept introduced from the outside is deeply rooted within our faith traditions, in family, in neighborhood life, and in all those things. So when the narrative focuses too much on Western expertise or that heroism, we risk overlooking the very pure traditions and dignity that protect those traditions in the first place. And a final point on this is that it's less about criticizing Western actors and more about recognizing the imbalance in whose stories are told. Mm-hmm. And if who tells the story? And who tells the story? And if we truly, truly, as humanitarians, believe in dignity, impartiality, and humanity, then we need to make room for multiple humanitarian traditions, as you said. And this means more listening. This means more centering local experience. This means checking our egos, our own, as well as the systems that we operate in. And that sometimes does get in the way of things. And in doing so, that we could be a more honest, more respectful, more transparent sector, and ultimately more effective as humanitarian actors, and as part of that, our practice.
Right. Ben, in terms of when we think of change, you've said that the public is able to contain many different thoughts, so that we shouldn't run away from complexity. And you've also said that the narratives, when we think of them, is not just about changing a few words here. We don't say this, sort of creating this list of shibboleths that you shouldn't say this. But I'm wondering, to what extent is it that it is not so much the narratives that we use, but it is a system itself that is problematic, and that we might be thinking of changing narratives rather than changing systems?
Absolutely. What we need to change is the systems. The reason why narrative matters is because narrative is really the way in which societies negotiate their understanding of reality and their understanding of what it is they seek to achieve, to aim for, and it therefore has huge systemic implications, right? If we look in history, we know that, for example, after World War II, there was a very strong narrative about solidarity that led to the Bretton Woods institutions, it led to the UN, it led to welfare states in the West, it led to national development states in the global South. A really, really strong, powerful narrative. And then we saw in the 80s, from about 75 to 1980s and beyond, a narrative around individualism, and that powered structural adjustment, privatization, Thatcherism, Reaganism, etc., and the collapse of the state. We saw after the 2008 crisis a really narrow nationalism, a turning inwards, a blaming of the other, and that drove 100 different anti-migrant policies, and it drove a withdrawal and a collapse of multilateralism. So narratives are important because they're about systems. This isn't about how can we use better language. This is about how can we drive better systems. And I think it's going to be hard and it's going to be challenging. So we shouldn't pretend it's going to be easy. And I think that one of the, sometimes when, as humanitarians, and I'll use the we because I think I don't want those who've dedicated their lives to humanitarianism to feel that all this discussion that we're having is an attack. It's not. It's a loving critique because we care about the aims that we're all trying to achieve and we want to achieve them well. But I think that what sometimes people feel is that they know this in their heart of hearts, but they feel under pressure. They worry that if they do this, their bosses say, but you have failed to ensure that we raise, enough money for this particular emergency, and therefore this. And I think what we need to hold is that the fuller aims of humanitarianism isn't that I want me to be the one helping people. The fuller aim is that I don't want anybody to be left in danger. And I know that requires acting across systems and enabling others. And any story in which people have themselves at the center is almost certainly wrong, almost certainly inaccurate. It's the maturity of a toddler who thinks that when they close their eyes, people disappear or they can't see them back, right? So stories where you're at the center are almost certainly wrong. But I think, unlike with a toddler, of course, it's harmless. When we create stories with ourselves at the center, we actually do immense harm. And when we say that these complex crises affecting people, what they need is me and my friends to raise as much money as possible to send people like me over to help people like them, that actually harms the bigger, deeper aim. So it is going to be a struggle. It's not going to be easy, and there are going to be trade-offs. But the old way of doing things wasn't just improper or imperfect. It's collapsing, and it was going to collapse. And those of us who were warning about this, and it was interesting just to reflect on that story Freddie shared, where he said, oh, it's the woke people saying, hang on, what about these problems? They're the one who caused it. It reminds me of the person who's warning their elderly relative that their cup is too close to the edge of the table and might fall, right? And you say, uncle, the cup, it might fall, be careful, but bring it back. And eventually the cup does fall. And then the uncle says, see, that's what you wanted. No, the reason we were warning you is because we didn't want this, right? And so we critique humanitarianism because we value it, right? And James Baldwin says the reason why I criticize my country is because I love it. And the reason why we criticize our sector is because we love it, because we want it to succeed, we want it to flourish, we want it to be the best it can. But it can't be the best it can with the narratives that have taken us to this point, which not only didn't succeed, they have broken down and fallen apart because the building was rotten. That's why it's fallen. And so if we want to build something better, we need to build it on stronger foundations. And I think the foundations are the kinds of things that Shaheen and Adelina have talked about today. I'm really excited about the work that's coming. It is scary. We should all be a little bit nervous. But I think we have to see this not just as a moment of crisis, but as a moment of opportunity.
Right. All right. I think we've got mics, so we're just moving into a question and answer session. So maybe I'll take 2 questions from the audience, and then we can do another round after that.
Hi, thank you. Do you think the sector lives too much in its own echo chamber? Because when you talk to the public, no one wants to see someone suffer, whether it's here or around the world. But a lot of the narrative here is charity starts at home, and that's been funded by quite horrible characters out there. And I guess my challenge is like, how do we empower? Because a lot of people, a lot of NGOs have a lot of donors, a lot of people out there how do we empower them to have courageous conversations where they're brave enough to say, well, actually, I do donate to X, Y, Z, and it's okay to fund the person who's a million miles away who actually I'll never meet. So I guess that's my challenge for the sector. Like sometimes it lives in its own echo chamber and it's a dying sector. Let's not escape from that. So how do you get the sector to do that and get them to think about how do we get the narrative away from you and me and a larger us?
Okay. Who is that question to?
Anyone?
Okay. Do we have anybody else who wants to ask? Okay.
I have the opposite question, which is how much are narratives and, I guess, behaviors contingent on, I guess, the politics that you pointed to, Ben, around, retrenchment and nativism and anti-globalization, and what you mentioned also around a lack of trust. And, we might be in our own echo chamber, but that echo chamber is very contingent on these broad political forces. So I'm wondering how, while we get out of our echo chamber, how much actually room and opportunity is there for us as humanitarians to drive different narratives? Or are we very contingent on the kind of prevailing narratives and attitudes and political behaviors?
So I guess that's for Ben. Shaheen, I'll ask you to answer her point, her question about, do humanitarians basically live in their own heads, and are these discussions that we are having, really about system change or about making us feel better about ourselves?
Thank you, my sister. No, I mean, look, are we struggling with today's realities? I think clearly we are. There's no question about that. We're in a different format, and from what we've seen, we are clearly struggling, and those are today's realities. So, I mean, going back to Ben's point, through the lens of narrative, principles on power, and misinformation, let's look at the narrative that we're drawn into. The narrative that we're drawn into, I'm going to take Gaza as an example. I feel that sometimes the narrative in humanitarian action, the narratives don't just describe the world, we produce it in that sense, right? So the prevailing narrative is crisis-affected people are helpless and the global north is their saviors. That's what you're saying. And aid is neutral and emergencies are exceptional, right? It's the architecture that we operate in. That's the architecture we operate in. So in the architecture, funding flows that favors donors. We look at risk frameworks that justify excluding local actors or factors. We have technical language that hides politics, a system where response is prioritized over justice, as Adelina previously mentioned. So the narrative is, and I think it's going to the second question as well, if the narrative has a flaw, then also the system has the same. So what is the flaw in the system? And I think we're here to try and fix that flaw as today's conversation. We're not going to get all the answers today because we can't simply do that in an hour and a half. But it's also principles, it's around principles and power as well, the power in which we operate and the principles in which we operate. So when power and narrative align, a clear example is Gaza, for example. When the systems break down, not only because of violence, but because narratives become a power structure that humanitarian actors rely on, which stopped functioning, by the way. It did stop functioning. On Gaza, we're talking about asymmetrical conflict. The power symmetry meant that principles were not enough in that situation. It was not simply to have humanitarian principles. So that humanitarian access that we depended on, the stronger party to the conflict did not allow it. In Gaza, as in many asymmetrical conflicts that we see, we still have to we still have to ask for access to permission. We still have to ask around fuel availability. We still have to ask for movement around medical teams, border controls, all those. And it all depended on decisions made by parties that we didn't have power over.
Right.
Yeah. And that was part of our humanitarian activity. So for us, it's principles alone couldn't compel access to protect those civilians. So it goes beyond that. We're in another phase of this now.
Okay. Ben, you want to respond to the second question?
Sure. We are in a narrative contestation, and our side is weak, and the other side is doing this better than we are. That's the starting point we need to have, and then related to that, it's much easier for the other side to access big money, big resources, and big backing because, of course, they don't threaten anybody who's immensely powerful, and they serve to redirect anger towards the most vulnerable. So it's an uneven playing field, but they're also engaging in this contestation more effectively than we are. I think one thing that those of us who care about international solidarity need to get better at is we need to get better at expressing, both in our words and in our deeds, that we also have solidarity for people within our countries, within the global north, who are having a hard time. I think that the narrative that says people in the global north are all lucky, are all doing well, and is a really, really dangerous and unhelpful one. And that can't be the basis of our argument for international solidarity. So when we're told, I mean, I used to work as well in UK on UK poverty issues, and people would tell me about drinking lemon and hot water in order to fend off hunger pangs. Teachers told me about kids who pretended to eat from a lunchbox because it was too embarrassing to admit that they didn't have anything packed in it. This was in London, right? So if we can't respond to that, then that fuels this idea that we only care about the people over there. So really, really important that people who care about international solidarity need to be front and center at challenging injustices at home as well, and then link. That your first conversation with somebody who is distressed about their own life and their own children's lives can't be, hey, don't you know how hard it is to be somewhere else? It has to be a genuine listening and understanding and caring response. And then once you're in that kind of relationship, then you can connect people with the international. But I think that it's a real risk factor to have a sector or an area of politics, which is really what we are, an area of politics, even if we don't want to admit that we are, that doesn't talk about the most immediate problems people have in the home country. One needs to talk about that too. And so I think alliances and connections are going to be really, really important. We can tell a really, really strong story that talks about improving people's lives here and improving people's lives everywhere. And we can talk about the interdependence and connectivity and why isolationism in the end hurts everybody, and how kicking the most vulnerable is really a trick that the most powerful play. But in order to be able to tell that story effectively, we have to seriously and skillfully and empathetically talk about and respond to the challenges that people are facing in the UK or in other countries in the global north.
All right. In a kind of very strange situation where it is the presenters have to ask to keep their responses shorter rather than the people who ask questions. But you have a response to what Ben was saying?
Patrick thinks that humanitarians have short answers, but this is how it, yeah. So I think I'm going to draw on the global solidarity framing that Ben just spoke about. And I'm going to give an example of a policy, of an initiative that had bridged that global cause with the reality that we see today. And it's a UK example. So with my political hat on as a local councillor, it's based on biomass boilers in the UK. And the Ukraine war and its impact on the pellets. So before 2022, many UK public buildings, schools and business and rural homes used biomass boilers. They relied on imported wood pellets. So a significant share of those pellets came from Russia, Belarus and Ukraine. So this is before 2022. So internationally, when the war began in Ukraine, this triggered international sanctions on Russia and Belarusian exports, which actually included biomass fuels. So Ukrainian pellet production and transport routes were disrupted, and the result was a sudden drop in supply of cheap Eastern European pellets. So even though my constituency in Solihull is not a heavy biomass dependent borough, what we saw as a result of the war was that it increased in costs. So some low-income households, especially in rural and the edge areas with older housing stock, were encouraged to adopt those biomass boilers because actually heating your home means that you have less respiratory illnesses, going back to the narratives that Ben was talking about. So some homes had poor insulation, like those in high-rises and those in council homes. So what happened as a result of that was the monthly heating costs for the poorer communities doubled in some cases. The cheap green heat narrative that we said model collapsed overnight. And then what happened was heating became unaffordable for the first time since installing those biomass systems. So for wealthier households in the borough and in my borough, there is a 12-year life expectancy gap between the north and the south, and that's just a 5-mile radius. It meant that choosing between heating and eating, but for the wealthy communities, it was just a mere inconvenience. But this meant vulnerable groups faced the hardest impacts, and the cases that I received were from single-parent families, elderly residents living in poor insulated homes. And then when we started charting as a health and social care opposition spokesperson, we realized that there is respiratory illnesses and conditions because of the damp and mold of those biomass boilers that could no longer heat the homes, created, not only was it linked to mental health stress link, but also to further COPD and respiratory illnesses. So I think as humanitarians, when we look at the global crisis at a local level, it actually makes, that's a story that you can tell so you can see the shock show that the global energy markets destabilized, and it's the poorest who felt the impact of that. And that's just giving you an example from a global to local context.
Right. All right. Adina, we have a question from online that I wanted you to address from Noshin Malik. So she talks of solidarity being a powerful principle, but she's asking, how do we translate, or he's asking, actually, I shouldn't assume. She's a she? All right. Okay, sorry. So how do we translate solidarity into practical actions that go beyond statements of support? And what are concrete steps that humanitarian actors and donors can take to make solidarity real for crisis-affected communities? How would it go beyond the talk of solidarity to what would it look like on the ground?
I mentioned earlier, hi Nushin, thank you for the question. I mentioned earlier about solidarity being horizontal. And one example came from Indonesia, the word gotong royong. Another example, mutual aid in Sudan. But Myanmar is also, when we after the coup, we see a real example of solidarity. So the examples of solidarity are everywhere. Right? Because as I mentioned, solidarity, humanity itself is rooted in solidarity. That's how it begins, right? That's how it started. So it's everywhere. It's how you embrace it and recognize it. And there is no one form of solidarity or humanitarianism. When you talk about examples in London, I was like also thinking about examples in my country. The discussion are kind of like different, right? And that is okay because, again, there are different forms of humanity, right? Or solidarity. What is important is that it is horizontal, the way I say it. Because as long as it is vertical, top down, as long as there is, that one position itself as superior than the others, right? Then it will be a never-ending story of injustice, the way I see it, because then you will politicize, right, the aid, not as a giving, but as actually as a geopolitical interest. I actually would like to suggest not only solidarity narrative, but also justice narrative. And why justice, right? Because it is important for those affected by the crisis. It is important for them to be protected in terms of dignity. How you operationalize it, right? There's some examples. It doesn't have to be too daunting, right? The word justice can be quite daunting for many. Resource justice, right? Direct funding to community networks and frontline responders instead of relying on the junta structures or the junta proxies. That resource justice. Equitable decision making. Let the local actors and frontliners make decisions on how to access the affected communities. Let the communities decide what kind of aid that they should be receiving. Because how the aid is given is actually more important in conflict situation than the aid itself.
Right.
Narrative justice. When the earthquake happened in April this year, the junta manipulated, right, the situation and recenter itself in terms of providing access to the international actors. When that happened, we actually have a role. That is to confront that narrative, the fabricated narrative of the junta, and basically say it loud that, hey, when it comes to earthquake response, that happened on top of the layers of suffering. And that happened because of your militarized governance, right? That's the way I said narrative justice. So you counter, right? You counter the fabricative narrative and give concrete examples. So that is narrative, the justice narrative, beyond solidarity narrative.
Right.
Because for the affected population, justice is more important for them.
All right, thanks for that. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd love to expand this. I know you had a question, but maybe you can speak to panelists later on after this. Really, thank you, Ben, Adelina, Shaheen. Let's have a round of applause for them.